Well, let's get started here. This is a continuation of our discussions for the Mining Law Summit on community resistance. And for this focus, we're looking particularly at Peru. My presenter this morning is Luis Carlos Rodrigo Prado, who is the principal of the firm of Rodrigo Elias Medrano. And Luis Carlos, welcome. Luis is one of the premier lawyers representing mining companies and mineral developers in Peru. And Luis Carlos, could you give us a little bit of your background and who you've worked with?
Sure. Thank you, John, and nice to be with you here. Well, I started working in mining activities like 30 or 35 years ago, and I have been, for example, a board member of Antamina, which is one of the largest operations in Peru, and it's a world-class operation since 1997, if I'm not mistaken. We work, and I personally work a lot with tech. I've done a lot of work with BHP, Billiton. We represent Anglo American, a lot of the copper producers like Freeport that owns Freeport-McMoRan, that owns Cerro Verde, which is another big operation. Southern Copper that operates in Peru in the late 50s. We do a lot of work with Chinese companies as well, like Chinalco and MMG, China Min Metals. We also do a lot of work with Peruvian companies like Minsur and Buenaventura and Poderosa, San Ignacio de Morococha, several medium big Peruvian producers. We work and represent Barrick. We represent also junior companies like Pembroke and Cerro de Pasco Resources and other smaller smaller developers and explorers. So I think I have a broad experience in terms of working on different areas of mining investment in Peru, both with local companies and with international investors. I've done also some international work in the region, in Colombia, in Chile, in Argentina. And I've been the chair of the mining committee of the International Bar Association for some years, the chair of the Latin American Regional Forum, and right now I am a member of the section of energy, infrastructure, natural resources, and environment of the International Bar Association as well. And a board member of several mining companies besides Antamina, El Brocal, Argentum, and other companies like Mapfre Peru, which is an insurance company, Talma, which is a airport logistics company, but mainly I focus on natural resources and mining. Sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think that what we want to talk about today is looking at issues of community resistance to mineral development. And I think that, to set the stage a little bit here is within Peru is the Peruvian mining law, the mineral resources of Peru are vested in the state. Is that correct?
Yes, the Constitution expressly establishes that all natural resources are owned by the nation, which is a way of saying that the whole population owns the natural resources, but the state is the one that manages, controls, and provides access to the use of natural resources. So yes, in a way, the state is the one that controls and possesses the management and the ability to allow private individuals or companies or communities to use and take advantage of the natural resources, including minerals, of course.
And this is through a system of concessions or something similar to that?
Yes, it's through a system of concessions, mainly mining concessions, in order to be able to explore and extract the minerals, and what we call beneficiation concessions to allow you to build plants and process the minerals, even up to refineries or conditions, depending on the level of processing that a company might want to do. But yes, it's a concession system that grants the ability to investors or private individuals or companies to access and extract and operate with minerals.
Now, in the process of applying and the granting of the concessions, whether it's a mineral development concession or a beneficiation concession, and I think for purposes of some people that aren't that familiar with the term, beneficiation is really just a processing. You might have a mill to crush the ore to produce a concentrate. That's generally called beneficiation. Is in the process of obtaining those rights, is there a discussion with the community? Is there a matter of community input?
Initially, no, because the granting of concessions is something that only is the first step that basically gives a certain individual or company the exclusive possibility of developing certain kind of mining activity, exploration or extraction of minerals through mining concessions, or processing through beneficiation concessions. But for any individual or company to actually be able to do that, besides the concessions, you need to obtain at least two things. The first one is some kind of right over the surface land, because the surface land is separated from the minerals that lay below. So if there's a community or a private individual or someone who owns the surface land on top of the area that has been granted for concession, you first need to reach some kind of agreement, either to purchase or to rent or have some easement or right of way to use that surface land. So that's essential. You cannot do anything, not even access the area without having obtained this agreement with the owner. And if it's a community, you need to reach an agreement with the community. If it's the state, you need to reach an agreement with the state. And the second element is that you also need to obtain a certain environmental certification. For exploration, it's what we call a semi-detailed environmental impact study. For any more advanced activity, even preparing a feasibility study or doing something more advanced than basic exploration, you need to obtain a full environmental and social impact study approved, which entails hearings and also a process to deal with a population that may be in some way affected, benefited, or not with the activity. So you need actually three things, no? You need actually a lot of things, but mainly the concessions you need, the agreement with the owner of the surface land, and environmental certification. Without those three things, any of those three things, you cannot access the area to do anything. So that's something that is special.
On your social impact review, Luis Carlos, who actually reviews that? Is that approved by the state?
It is approved by the state, by the mining ministry, but before being approved, you have to hold what is called working meetings with the population of the area in which you are going to carry out your activities, to inform them of what is the activity you will be carrying out, what impacts, beneficial or not, may exist, what are the mitigation plans you have, and so on. Then they have the possibility to, of course, ask any questions, raise any concerns, and you engage in a conversation, in workshops with them. And only once this is finished, there is, of course, an established process for this, the authorities evaluate the plan and the environmental proposal, your impact study, and approve it or disapprove it. Besides that, since 2011, we have an obligatory prior consultation process, which is carried exclusively by the state, and it's done, there's a big discussion, but it's done between granting the concession and issuing any additional administrative permit. Before, for example, you can carry out exploration, you need to have a permit that is called an approval to start exploration. Before you obtain that permit, if there are indigenous communities whose rights may be affected by the activity that you plan to carry out, then you do have to, the state has to carry out this mining prior consultation activity.
Now, I think that we have heard in recent times a certain amount of community objections to mining operations, and the specific one that comes to mind is Tintaya. Could we talk a little bit about what the basis of community objections were there, and how did that come about?
Sure. There is, of course, a lot of, I think, interaction between communities and companies, and this comes from many decades ago. So there's a legacy from the time when mining activities were carried out without really having due care for the social and environmental impacts. So there is this legacy that actually creates problems between communities and companies. And this is something that has evolved throughout time. Right now, what we can see is that besides having these past legacies that you can unfortunately still see in some areas with tailings and things that were not properly managed, modern responsible mining activities are being carried out in many different projects and operations in the country. But then you have a political component that has been evolving throughout time, because mining generates a lot of wealth in different aspects for the country. It's certainly the engine of our economy. It generates around, right now, 15% of the GDP of the country. Around 65% of our exports are related to mining, and there is a lot of interest from different stakeholders to get a portion of those earnings and wealth. So there is a political component that has been growing throughout time. Mining is one of the key elements in any political discussion in Peru. Then you have environmental concerns and social concerns. I would say not really from the communities that are part of the area that is related to the mining activity. Those communities usually are very much in favor of the activities because they get a lot of benefits from training, education, health, many different things that unfortunately the Peruvian state has never been able to provide to them. And now a mining operation brings that and entails a more active participation, not only from the Peruvian state, but also from international entities like the World Bank or the UN and different organizations that start to work with a mining company to provide all these benefits to the area. So those communities usually are very much in favor of the activity. However, you have some surrounding communities that are not, initially at least, part of the so-called area of influence of the operation. And those are the communities that mainly, in order to be able to get some of the benefits and participate in some of the health and education and other programs that are developed for the areas that are within the area of influence, those are the ones that generate resistance and friction with the companies in order to be included as part of the area of influence. So these three components, I think, are the ones that, for example, in Tintaya, which is an old mining district in Peru, and that right now is part of what we call the Southern Copper Corridor, which is, besides the Chilean desert, probably the main area for copper, not only operations, but projects for the future. So it's a very important area, and there's a lot of interaction there between communities and the state and the companies. And there is a friction that is related to those legacies and political aspects that I was mentioning, and objectives of communities, natural objectives of obtaining more benefits. And also because there is two things that in Peru are very relevant, I think. This issue of the surface land, so who gets to actually negotiate with the company and benefits from what the company grants as consideration for the use of that land. And secondly, which is also, I think, very important, water issues. The highlands in Peru, where Tintaya, for example, is located, and other operations or projects like Tia Maria or Quellaveco, where Anglo American is now developing a $6 billion project, the water issues are very relevant. And there's a big distrust from communities that basically are very poor, do not have infrastructure to use the water throughout the year. So when there is the rain in the rainy season, they get a lot of water, but in the dry season, all that water has gone to the ocean and they don't have any way of actually obtaining water. So how to make sure that those communities do not fear that a mining operation that may be very intensive in the use of water and energy and so on will not let them, even with less water than before, is one of the main issues. And Tintaya and Antapacay and Las Bambas, which are in the same area, are sort of facing that issue with their communities. The most important ones, that are the ones that are within the clear area of influence, are very supportive of the activities, and they have obtained a lot of benefits from those mining operations. For example, in Tintaya, there was an agreement since the early 2000s for the communities to obtain 3% of the earnings of the company, and they have obtained hundreds of millions of dollars. And that happens in many other operations as well. To give you an example, which is very interesting, San Marcos, for example, which is a very small village in the highlands close to Antamina. I was there in 1997, before the 1996, before the actual construction of the operation started, and it was a very tiny village which had a budget of less than, in dollars, it would be probably $4,000 or $5,000 a year for the major to do something. Nowadays, that village has a budget of $80 or $100 million per year. So that has created a big transformation, of course, a big problem as well, because people were not prepared to actually manage those kinds of funds. And that's one of the big problems. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of funds, but there's corruption. In San Marcos, for example, the last 5 majors, 3 are in jail, 1 is dead, and the other one has flown away from the country. So that's the type of thing that you face here.
On these particular examples that you're talking about, Luis Carlos, particularly, let's talk about the 3% of profits that are relegated to the community. Was that a condition of the concession, or was that an agreement from the mining company itself?
No, it was an agreement by the mining company. At that time, BHP Billiton reached an agreement with the communities of the area, and it was totally voluntary. And that was, I think, a very good step forward. Now, of course, the communities want more. So 3% seems little for them, and there's more discussions, but there is this type of thing in other operations or projects like Michiquillay in the northern part of Peru, for example, or Quellaveco in the southern part of Peru, which were 2 privatized projects. What the privatization setup was what we call special mining fund. So 50% of what the company pays for the privatization, which in Michiquillay, for example, now has a fund that is over $300 million, or in Quellaveco, it's around that sum as well, is a sort of trust that is managed by, it's a board where 2 of the members are appointed by the communities, 2 of the members are appointed by the company, and 1 member is appointed by the Ministry of Energy and Mines. So
okay,
this
and
fund
is this particular project one that was initiated by the government, or was it put together by the mining company itself?
These social funds were agreed between the state and the government with the companies that were interested in participating in the privatizations. So they passed a law and regulations to set up these funds, and they do have a lot of money. The problem, just in the cases where companies and communities agreed to provide some funding directly, is that the capacity to actually invest wisely and use adequately those funds is very poor, really poor, and that's a big problem.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts as to how that system could be improved to avoid, well, let's call it local, let's call it what it is, local corruption. Is there a way of potentially managing that?
I think that we certainly need to make sure that there is a way that these funds are not exclusively used by the people who are in these boards right now, but that they need to last for the future and further generations to come, because there's certainly, as I say, a lot of money in those funds. Besides those funds, the companies, of course, pay what we call the mining canon and the special mining tax and the royalties. And those funds also go to the regional governments, to the local governments of the areas where mining operations take place. So, as I say, money is not a problem. All those regional governments and local governments have a lot of money. The problem is, as you mentioned, first, corruption by the people who are elected to be regional governors or majors, because they only want to get some money for them. So that's something that needs to be managed properly. I do think that the judiciary and the whole judicial system needs to make a big effort there. We need to train people in these remote areas to make sure that they have the capabilities and the knowledge to actually manage those kinds of funds. That's something that mining companies have been working on for decades now, but it's not easy. It's something that I think it's the right way. I mean, it's a good system, but there are situations where the people are the ones who are not actually using those funds wisely and properly. It's like in probably most countries in the world.
Yeah, Luis Carlos, a thought that was occurring to me: would it make a difference if we expanded the range of influence or the area of influence on mining operations to include more of the areas that are maybe not impacted as much as the immediate communities, but to expand it to the areas that are nearby? Do you think that would assist?
I think it would be very important, but the problem with that, we have tried that, and there's several political parties who propose that. The problem is that the communities and the majors and local governments of the areas that right now are part of the area of influence of a project are the ones who oppose to include a broader area, because then they will receive a little bit less and others will receive some of that wealth. So they are the ones who actually oppose to something like that. And it's really terrible, but that's one of the problems. There is a law that at this point in time, as I mentioned, establishes that all mining royalties, 50% of the income tax produced or generated by mining companies and the mining canon all these sums go back to the regional governments and local governments of the area where the company paying them is operating. And there's a bill that is meant to say this money has to be used by not only those small communities, but by broader areas. And they are the ones who oppose it. And it's very difficult to change that because Congress, unfortunately, is very populistic. And this, well, Peru is a mining country, so there's a lot of mining activity around the country and a lot of communities who actually, and majors and regional governors who oppose to have this broadening a little bit more. But I agree with you, it would be a very good step forward.
Now, I know that there has been some recent changes in the political situation in Peru. Is this going to affect the mining operations and the possibility of being more inclusive, I suppose, that in providing assistance to communities?
Honestly, I think that there, as I say, there is a lot of funds and money already available to the regional governments and the local governments. For example, in Cajamarca, the area where from the president, the current president comes from, there is right now billions of dollars that have not been invested by the local regional governor and majors of the area, where, for example, La Zanja or Michiquillay and many other areas that can be developed have not benefited from this big wealth. So they oppose mining because they don't see the benefits. And it's not because there's no money, it's because the authorities are not capable of using them properly, either because of lack of training or because of corruption. And I don't think, honestly, this government is going to make a difference. Right now, there's a discussion to increase taxes for mining activities. That's not necessary. The governments, as I say, the central government, the local governments, the regional governments have a lot of money. In Peru, all this wealth, the regional governments have not been able to invest more than 55, 60% of the funds they already have. So it's not a problem of having more money. In 2021, because of the prices, just the income tax from mining has doubled from what it was in 2019, so prior pandemic, and that's something that they will not be able to use properly. So my fear is that this will only bring more corruption. We are seeing people who are appointed to key positions in the government that are really not very transparent and respected people. And that's a big problem because we are losing another opportunity to actually include these communities, provide them with benefits like education, health, training, a lot of things that infrastructure that they really need. And I perfectly understand that they oppose mining because they don't see the benefits. Even though companies are doing their best, there's another program in Peru that is called Works for Taxes that companies have been using a lot during these last years, which allows companies to carry out infrastructure projects with funds that correspond to future tax payments that they agree with the local governments to manage the investment on behalf of them. And that's the way in which a lot of irrigation projects, roads, bridges, and things are being done in the last years. And that's something that I believe is working very well. So
so you, as I understand your position, you think that the mining company itself would be in a better position to manage at least a portion of the local infrastructure contribution as opposed to either governmental initiation, or getting back to the example that you used of the trust agreement, where you had representatives of the company, the local government, and the national government involved. Would that be your view of how these should be managed?
I think it sounds a little bit inadequate, in the sense that most people believe that companies are the ones creating all problems with communities, and to give them even more power by allowing them to actually carry out the infrastructure projects with future taxes sounds crazy. But in 2006, when Alan Garcia took on his second time as president of Peru, he approved a system that was called the voluntary contribution. And this system obliged, you had to agree as a mining company, but most companies agreed to do it, to sign an agreement with the government to provide 3.75% of their net earnings after taxes to carry out infrastructure projects. And this was between 2006 and 2011. And they added a little bit in 2007, more or less, health and nutrition projects. And it was a huge success, because the mining companies, which are better prepared to manage funds, to prepare projects, engineering, and carry out them in time and with budget, did it. And just as two examples, again, Antamina was able to reduce infant malnutrition problems in the Ancash region by 50% in 5 years, something that the government had not been able to do in hundreds of years. That program stopped in 2011 because Ollanta Humala assumed the presidency and he shut down the system. And again, the malnutrition in Ancash has increased by 60% in these last 10 years. So
why was the system shut down?
Because it was something that was done by a prior government from a different political party. It was not politically beneficial for Humala to continue that. He said, no, I don't want that. I want the money for the government. So he substituted that voluntary contribution program by the special mining tax and an increase in royalties. And now having this system, which is not bad because it's providing funds to the government, but they are not capable of using them properly. That's one of the problems. So I do think that giving mining companies this opportunity to do things like works for taxes, working with the regional and local governments, they cannot do it by themselves. The ones who prioritize the projects are the regional governments and the local governments. But the one who manages the project is the company. And they have responsibility and liability if they don't do it right. So I believe that's a good thing, but politically, right now, the new government, for example, is opposing to that. They want to give everything to the regional governments, not have the companies involved. And the trusts that we were talking about, for example, in those special funds, the company doesn't have a majority. They only have 2 or 5 in the board. And that's why they are not working, because unfortunately, the communities themselves and the government are not able to really use those funds properly. So in my view, having the mining company being obliged to use those funds for the benefit of the communities and with a strict liability provisions that make them work with the best engineering companies, execute the projects on time and within budget, is what the country should be aiming for. But politically, right now, it's not easy to obtain support from that, unfortunately.
Well, that is unfortunate. Do you have your crystal ball here to say how we could improve the situation?
I think that, as in everything, if you have good examples, then people start to believe in things, because the main problem with mining right now, and in general with private investment, I would say in Peru, is that there is not trust from communities and the peasants and the poorer people in the country, who have honestly been abandoned by the government for centuries. They don't trust anybody. So they don't trust the government, they don't trust the private investors. But when they start seeing that in certain areas, these things are working, then they start believing. It takes time, it takes training, it takes fighting corruption, which is one, I do believe, of the main problems. You know, from the 23 regions that we have, I believe there is around 12 governors that are either facing criminal charges for corruption or in jail or have fled the country. And this is not something strange. It happens all the time. Our former president, Vizcarra, who was taken out of office because of corruption allegations by Congress. I mean, there's apparently a lot of evidence showing that when he was governor of Moquegua, which was one of the starved regions because of mining operations in that region by southern Peru, and education had really raised incredibly, and people were very happy with how investments in schools and education had taken place I think this was between 2008 and 2012. But now he's facing allegations of corruption, even at that time and when he was president. So that's what makes people distrust everybody and everything. So how to build trust and how to make sure that there are good examples, as I believe there are, and that others can really see, that is what we need to make sure that happens in these next years.
Do you think that it would assist more if the mining companies were involved more in the local political process?
Unfortunately, the more responsible and big ones, which are the multinational companies and the big Peruvian companies, they, because of their policies, which I think are correct, they cannot get involved in politics. So they will not be involved in things like political discussions or things like that. Initially, they were very reluctant with the voluntary contribution program. They didn't want to be seen as substituting the government in carrying out and executing educational, health, training, infrastructure projects, because they all said that's what the government needs to do with the funds that we pay as taxes. But finally, they realized that if they didn't do it, anybody was going to do it. So they started doing it, and they did it well. Because of political reasons, that was unfortunately shut down. This works for taxes system. I think, along with the special funds and trusts that exist in some privatized projects, should allow companies to do this in a way that is not opposed to their policies and codes of conduct and ethics, but still actually make sure that these benefits and the infrastructure and the health and educational projects reach the most abandoned and poor people in the country, which is what we need to show how mining is really contributing to the development of the country. And I think it is. Of course, there's bad companies, there's bad people everywhere, but the main responsible big mining operations that we have in Peru today, I think are world-class examples of how you can really do a lot, not only for your shareholders and usual stakeholders like your workers and so on, but for regions in the country.
Yeah. Well, Luis Carlos, I appreciate very much your insights to the issues of how we provide adequate funding for social programs within the communities. And perhaps this summit will add a little bit to the ongoing discussions, and who knows that maybe we can finally get something done here. So I appreciate very much hearing your views.
I really thank you, John. I completely agree that I'm sure this is going to provide new ideas and ways of dealing with these problems, which are not only exclusive to Peru, but I do think that something that is very important and could be very meaningful is that international organizations, including universities, may start working with countries like Peru in order to help communities and governments, especially regional and local governments, actually use properly the immense funds that they have available to benefit a lot of people. Peru reduced poverty from 53% in 1990 to 21% in 2015. In the last 5 years, including the pandemic, unfortunately, poverty has increased again, rounding 27, 28% and growing, even though the country has a lot of money, a lot of funds. And that's really something that we need to turn around, because it's terrible to see a country like Peru that is beautiful and with immense opportunities to be not taking advantage of, for example, this wonderful cycle of prices in minerals. No? And that's something I think that international organizations can also work and help in turning around. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Luis Carlos.
Nice seeing you. Bye-bye.